A lot has happened since the last episode. In fact, there was supposed to be an episode between this one and the last, but because my external hard drive stopped working and I lost basically all of the footage for what's supposed to be said episode. If you've come from the last episode, it might seem confusing. The current agenda: make a sheep farm. And not just any sheep farm, a massive automated sheep farm. This is the area we prepared for the purpose of our soon-to-be woolly companions. And there's a lower level to the space too. This is the area going to be dedicated to storing the 16 different colours of wool. Yeah, it's a large area. There is still the issue of food for the sheep. I have no wheat, and as much as I'm unfazed when it comes to their appetites, I needed it for breeding. The plan was to use all of this dirt to create a separate area for the wheat farm. A side note, something cool about large scale projects is how impressive they look as you fly back towards them. When I made this place in the lost footage, sounds like an Indiana Jones film, I put a glowstone block 1 block higher than the rest of the flattened space to mark the centre point of the entire area. From there I towered up and marked out the dimensions of the inner perimeter of the wheat farm, which, if you hadn't guessed, was going to be in the sky above the sheep farm. That inner perimeter was to be made out of smooth stone, so it's handy I had 3 large chests of the stuff, again from the lost footage. There's a bit of a theme here. That should be enough for an outer border, depending on the size of the farm. Once the inner perimeter had been built, I mapped out the dimensions of the farmable land, keeping in mind not to make it massive because I didn't need a massive wheat farm, and as much as my inner voice was telling me to make the world's largest wheat farm anyone had ever seen, I stayed firm with myself. Dirt placed, in went the trenches, using wooden planks as the base. Lit the place up to stop mob spawns, filled the trenches with water, added more torches, this time on top of the water via the trapdoor method, and then went scavenging for wheat seeds. I already had some, but this bumped me up to a few stacks. The plan was to get an entire inventory of wheat seeds, but I got bored after a few stacks. Doesn't matter, after a few harvests I'll have more than enough. I'd build a small AFK room to safely wait for the crops to grow, and after some on and off AFK work, the farm had gotten to the point of having wheat planted in every available space. As far as I'm concerned, this farm is small, but it's still slightly overkill. I didn't have any sheep, so there'd been a bit of a build-up of wheat I hadn't been able to use yet. Something that would be remedied. Everything was in place to finally focus on the sheep in this so-called sheep farm, and there was an abundance of 4 of them in the wild. And using animal handling techniques like an Inuit shepherd, I got all of them safely back to the pen I'd made, where they would be blackmailed with food to breed for me into the world's largest army of sheep anyone had ever seen. In time, it would be a while before I got there. I'd been breeding them intermittently until then, when I was back in the overworld. For the time being, business took me to the nether, specifically a soul sand valley for bone blocks. In episode 5.5, which became 4.5 because of the lost footage, and you can watch by becoming a member to this channel, I smelted a shit ton of sand into glass blocks because I'm going to be building a glass wall around the farm. But not just regular glass, I'm talking stained glass, that expensive shit. White stained glass. That meant I'd need a lot of white dye. You could find bone blocks in the nether which can be turned into bone meal, and in turn the bone meal can be turned directly into white dye. The skeletons weren't exactly on board with this, but you know what, who cares? And so, with access to white dye, back in the overworld I stained as much of my glass as I could, which turned out to be about 1/3 of all the glass I had at my disposal. White glass in hand, I went to the lower layer of the farm to begin getting it in place. However, for some reason, I hadn't removed the very outer edge of the flooring and replaced it with smooth stone. So I deposited the glass back into a chest, picked up the smooth stone I still had lying around, and got the smooth stone into place like I should have done when I made this space. Then I started on the white glass. I wasn't sure if I had enough, and that's only because whenever I need a lot of blocks for a project, I'm always certain I've got enough, and no matter how many hundreds of stacks I get, it's never enough, and I have to get more. However, this time, to my surprise, I not only had enough, I had many to spare. Afterwards, it was hard to tell if there was a wall there at all until I was flying right next to it, but rest assured, this is peak luxury. I'd only planned on having a glass wall in between the lower layer of the farm and the upper, but that seems stupid when I enjoy encasing things in a larger build, even if that build is nothing more than glass. Sorry, let me rephrase, stained glass. Seeing as I had a huge amount remaining, I thought, why not make a huge glass cube encasing the entire sheep farm, minus the wheat farm. It was too high up. In terms of the amount of white glass I'd need, I was sure I'd have nowhere near enough to encase the place in a giant box, as I'd always dreamed of doing from 5 minutes prior. I put in the dimensions of the height of each of the walls, and then got on with using up the rest of the white glass I had, while I was in the mood for it. Not to mention, I could use the opportunity to regularly breed the sheep in between placing blocks. A second surprise of the video, I had enough white glass to build up the entirety of one of the walls on one side of the top top layer. And even more surprising, enough for a second wall. That didn't extend to a third wall, but it was a good 60 to 70% complete. I'm fairly certain the rest of the glass blocks I'd collected were going to be enough to finish what I'd started. It was just a case of getting my hands on enough white dye to transform them into the lustrous white glass needed. That would wait for now. The sheep had multiplied into a number more than enough for what I'd need. Finally, I could focus on the sheep of the sheep farm, is what I'd like to say, but I realised the sheep farm couldn't be built without the blocks and materials to do so. The material highest on my priority list was iron. It was needed for hoppers and minecarts, etc., and without an iron farm, I was having to do as my great to the power of 3 granddad used to do, and go working in the mines, which translated into setting up a small mining space, a mining hub if you will, for centralised storage of the blocks I'd collect in the process, and then set out with a purpose, find iron and stop at nothing until I had several stacks of the stuff. I already had a lot of iron blocks gained from excavating the train for the sheep farm in the episode Never to be Seen, but wasn't sure if it would be enough for what's needed. I stayed away from exploring large caves only because 1, I couldn't be bothered to light them up, and 2, exploration of those giant spaces suck time away from you. I only want to relax and strip mine and not deal with any mob hindrances. Of course, if I stumbled into a cave and saw iron ore, sure thing, I'd go for it, but for the most part, no. I did that for a couple of hours or so until I wanted a change of scenery, some open air. Taking inspiration from Alex Honnold, I went scrambling in the mountains for some easy to find iron. And when I say mountains, I mean bits of terrain tall enough to technically be called mountains in the real world, but in Minecraft were nothing but bootleg versions. Still, I was able to easily spot iron from a distance, but after some time, all this mountain malarkey got tiring. So in the comfort of my chair in front of my monitor, I decided to call it a day. Back at my mining hub, I picked up all of the ores I'd found underground and flew back to the sheep farm. Now, iron wasn't the only thing I'd picked up. In fact, all ores were on the menu, including the copper. Using a fortune through pick, I mined the ore blocks for smelting. I don't need them, but at some point I will, and when that happens, they'll be ready. Although kind of embarrassing, I forgot about the wheat farm and hit my head on the bottom of it when towering up. Now I'd be a laughing stock in front of my sheep. But I'd have the last laugh when they were trapped inside their little glass boxes, supplying me with their woolly coats for the rest of their lives. As I did with the copper, I did the same with the coal and iron ore blocks and managed to multiply their number with my good fortune. Both the iron and copper went into the furnaces to turn into their tasty ingot evolutions, the coal into my smelting shulker box. Progress on the farm wouldn't happen until the iron was smelted as a necessary component for the materials used in the sheep farm itself. I went to my little AFK chamber and would stay there until the iron was ready. Skip ahead one hard AFK session later and the iron had cooked, a full inventory's worth, which was used to make as many hoppers as possible, several stacks, and I had iron to spare because I ran out of chests and wood to replenish the chests before I ran out of the iron. Dispensers have an annoying recipe of needing bows to craft them, so I paid the Fletchers a visit. The frustrating thing is that you can't stack them because of their durability mechanic. I understand, it's just inconvenient. As for another ingredient needed, cobblestone, so I was back at our mining hub, seeing as it seemed like it was going to be the best place to get the block. I set up an emerald beacon. Yes, I got a beacon block again from the lost footage. Seems almost suspicious at this point, but seriously, I'm kicking myself. And while we're on the subject, I don't know if I ever said, but all of my fully enchanted backup tools were gained in the footage I lost. Go figure. Most of my backup picks are silk touch enchanted, which isn't going to work here as I'll just pick up the stone itself. No, I had to once again call upon a fortune 3 pick to get the job done. And obviously, while we were there, it didn't hurt to pick up any additional clumps of iron we came across as a byproduct. Having gotten more than enough cobblestone, I crafted an entire stack of dispensers, one at a time, because as said, I couldn't stack the bows in the crafting recipe section. It was extremely painful, and hopper minecarts weren't any better, because like bows, minecarts don't stack, and you can't automatically refill the recipe like you can with villager trades. Shears were easier to make. For a stack, I needed 2 stacks of iron, and so I'm kind of glad I didn't spend all of my iron earlier on hoppers. I thought for sure I'd need iron for observers, but no, quartz. Had to take a small trip to the nether for a few minutes, but then I was back and making the observers. And again, found myself getting more wood. I really need an auto tree farm at some point. I didn't have enough to make all of the chests needed for the sheep farm because I'd used them all up when crafting the hoppers earlier. Crafted a couple of stacks of them, and I made sure to get enough wood for the trapdoors I needed too. I always imagine rails to be more expensive than they actually are because in reality they're really cheap. Finally, we could work on the actual sheep farm. I needed to figure out where each of the sheep were going. I got the materials to set up and shear 64 sheep at a time, meaning 4 sheep per colour. I wanted 10 sheep per colour, but without an iron farm there are restraints to our limited iron. Not that it bothers me, we have the space to expand this farm tenfold when the day of unlimited iron comes. For now, a stack of sheep is a good start. I didn't build at the centre of the huge space we have because we have a lot of shit in the way. The the sheep pen, the auto smelters, and a mixed match of chests with all sorts of blocks and items. They will all be moved and I'll be able to double, triple, quadruple and so forth production, which is important for me because it limits the amount of AFK work I have to do. Now, this top layer of the farm is only one block in depth because of how I excavated the terrain underneath, meaning setting up the storage for collecting the wool underneath each of the sheep is a little awkward because there are no blocks to place my chests and hopper against. I can't just put them next to air blocks, so I had to put these temporary placeholder blocks first. This is the part where I should be putting that storage system into place, but for whatever reason I forgot I'd crafted the chests needed and put them with the rest of the materials, so I was back in nature putting in the work for nothing. The collection system is simple: a large chest with hopper connected to it. Above the hopper is a minecart hopper on top of a rail. In time I'm planning on massively increasing the storage system for this place, but they didn't build Rome in a day, and I'm not expecting myself to. Not without a fully functioning iron farm. For now, this is fine. This is going to be a stupid question, but do the shears use up durability inside of the dispensers? You can tell I've made auto sheep farms before. I legitimately have no clue. Time would tell, I guess. I'd find out one way or another. The redstone dust that would bring this farm to life was put into place, filled in the holes I'd made setting up the storage so I wouldn't fall down them, and then put in the trapdoors for accessing the chests that will collect the wool. I tell you what, these wandering traders are proven useful. Moss blocks were on the agenda. One of those things I don't need now, but when I do, I'm saving myself a painful search. With storage systems in place, I used glass to build the rest of the chambers, which are about the same size as your average apartment in Tokyo. Speaking of cramped spaces, their current shared living quarters wasn't exactly spacious either, and when I tried to put in a gate to let them out a few at a time, it was as if a dam burst because they spilled out like an unstoppable force. I knew it was gonna happen, but I guess I misjudged just how packed it must have been in there because all of my attempts of getting a gate in place were in vain, and I just had to let a lot of them out into freedom. Of course, that was a lie, it would never be freedom, but for the time being they could enjoy roaming about the place. Eventually enough of them got out of the way that I could put in the gate in place and plug the leak, but by then a lot more sheep had gotten out than I thought. It turned out to be positive though, because it turned out it was a lot easier to run around grabbing them and taking them over one at a time to their new homes rather than using the gate to the pen to get a couple or a few at a time. In my mind, I'd had an image of them wandering off and getting lost forever, and while yes, they did wander, it wasn't at speeds I needed to be concerned with, and in reality I still had so many sheep it didn't matter if I lost most of the ones that had gotten out. Not that it happened, there were more than enough to fill the 64 glass boxes, and as for the rest of the sheep, now enjoying paradise, I planned to leave them alone and let them do their own thing. No, really I did, but they were eating the grass and making the place look messy. The last step for the sheep farm to be technically complete would be to get the dyes to change their colours. There were 16 colour variants as said before. With the 64 sheep I had, that's 4 sheep per colour. And another way you can tell I've made a sheep farm before is the way I tried to dye the sheep that had been sheared already. It wouldn't let me. Didn't even realise you couldn't dye them unless they had their woolly coats fully grown. Kind of common sense I guess now that I think about it. So out came the shears from the dispensers to stop their wool getting sheared before I had a chance to use the dyes. In hindsight it would have been easier and quicker to remove the redstone dust, but at least I saw the durability of the shears were being used up, meaning I'd have to stock each dispenser with 9 of them to make full use. Although I do have another question: does unbreaking 3 shears have an effect on the durability used up in the auto farm? Like obviously it does when I use it, the player uses it, but will the enchantment work when it's inside of a dispenser? Once their coats had grown back, we used their dyes to change their colour, put the shears back into place, and I had myself a fully functioning sheep farm. Would it be quick? No. Could I expand it in the future to a completely unnecessary size for a solo player on a solo world when no one is going to appreciate it except me? Yes. The last thing I wanted to do for the episode was to finish the white stained glass walls and put a white glass roof over the entire thing. It was going to take a lot of glass and a lot of white dye. I had the glass, not the white dye. There are a number of different ways of obtaining it. For me, like last time, I went into the nether to hunt for a soul sand valley biome to take the bone blocks, because bone blocks can be turned into a lot of bone meal and in turn can be turned into white dye. Basically exactly as what I said before. Like anything I'm searching for in the nether, I deploy the straight line strategy, where I simply choose a direction and head in a straight line until I find what I need. Eventually it will happen. What can I say? The straight line strategy never lets me down. When I think about it, bone blocks are probably one of my favourite blocks of the game, definitely top 3, and that's mostly because of the sound they make when you mine them. On the other end of the spectrum, this is one of my least favourite things, breaking a fully enchanted tool. The annoying thing was I'd been telling myself to keep an eye on its durability literally a minute before this happened, and I still forgot. But I'm a rich guy now, I can afford to break tools. Look at this bag of bones coming in with a drip. I respect his fashion, but that wouldn't stop me from killing him. The plan was to stop at a full shulker box of bone blocks, but as these things go, I ended up going over by a few blocks. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that should be all the bone blocks I need, and I immediately put them to use to make the white dye for staining the glass I owned white. That amounted to nearly 11 large chests of white dye. Originally, I thought all of this glass would be enough to finish encasing this place in a giant white box, but now I'm not so sure. Not when I was burning through more glass than I remember using when making the walls. It was alarming how quickly it was disappearing, and how little amount of space I was covering. IRL, I was so tired and kept falling off the wall as I drifted away. It was probably best I called it a day here, which is what I did. The next day, feeling refreshed, I got the walls finished and began on the roof. This entailed spacing out the glass by 4 blocks and running them across the entire area in strips. Afterwards, I'd be able to fill in the rest of the blocks quickly. At least, that was the plan. I'm curious to get my hands on the Swift Sneak enchantment to see how much of a difference it makes. This would be the perfect opportunity to put it to use. It took some time, but several YouTube videos in the background later, and we had all of the strips put into place. And I had 5 large chests of white stained glass remaining to get it finished. Something tells me I'm not going to have enough, but with the strips in place I should be able to use up those 5 chests of glass fairly quickly, and of course having YouTube on in the background helped, until I completely ran out. It was a sad time. I was crying, the sheep were crying, my momentum had been really kicked into gear and it had to be shifted back to neutral. As predicted, it wasn't enough. I'd gotten halfway and that was 5 large chests worth of glass. So I took 12 shulker boxes, equating to 6 large chests worth of storage, to the desert and wouldn't leave until all 12 of those shulker boxes were full. That was a lot to collect, but with the ability to insta-break the sand and a fully kitted out shulker box with fully enchanted diamond shovels, it took only a little over an hour. Not too shabby. Sand collected. Back at the sheep farm, I put all of the sand into the auto furnaces I'd left set up in case of an emergency smelt. Well, look no further than right here. But then realised an emergency smelt can't happen without any fuel to do so. I had enough to start, and when I say start I mean nothing more than that. So I laid out single furnaces to pump wood into to turn into charcoal, but guess what? I only had a few stacks of wood to my reputable name. And rather than fix that issue immediately, I instead distracted myself with assigning a coloured wall block to each of the sheep chambers, depending on what colour sheep they were. For example, I'd put an orange wool block at the front of the orange sheep chambers, red wool blocks next to the red sheep, yellow wool blocks next to the yellow sheep. You get the idea, kind of common sense. And then it was back to facing reality. I needed logs, but I didn't want to fly off to a forest somewhere where my furnaces would be outside of render distance and nothing being smelted. No, I wanted to stay nearby and have the sand smelt while I gathered wood. I had 2 birch saplings in a chest and a dream, and with the power of bone meal I insta-grew the shit out of them. Then I chopped down the trees, obtained more saplings to grow even more trees, to get more wood, to get more saplings, and so the cycle repeated. Enough times that my own makeshift at home forest multiplied in size to the point I was getting stacks of wood that I was throwing into the furnaces to obtain fuel and further feed the auto smelters that were cooking the glass. One semi-AFK / off camera session later, because I was actively chopping down trees and I had a lot of glass to my name once again. The smelters weren't completely finished, but they were close enough I'd be able to restart placing glass and have them finish in about half an hour. The tree harvesting, by the way, had gone well. Our wood shulker box was back to being full, plus another shulker's worth of logs in this chest, and that's not accounting for the dozens of stacks of logs that went into cook to turn into charcoal to feed glass production. And as if we hadn't been away, it was back to crafting white stained glass and fervently placing them non-stop. It wasn't long, relatively speaking, until we had all of them in place. It took 5.5 large chests, so we had half a large chest of glass to spare. Despite it being nothing more than a giant white transparent box, it looks impressive, but being impressive doesn't fix the fact I can no longer get inside the giant box, so I put in a fairly sizable circle I'd be able to fly through. It meant the only way to get in and out of the farm was with an elytra, but I had several, plus access to unlimited rockets, so no biggie. Because of limited resources, we're only able to get 64 sheep into place, and you can see how much space we still have to expand into. I think we could get 16 to 20 times as many sheep as we have now. Once I have that iron farm, there will be sheep everywhere, mark my words. Never forget your roots. Trading with these guys turned my life around, and I'm still as hungry today for emeralds as I was back then. I need money to buy several stacks of glowstone. It was also a great opportunity to repair any of my tools that were low on durability. Now, it might seem like I was going overboard on the emeralds, but I haven't zombified and cured any of the villagers, so glowstone is still expensive. That didn't make it any less satisfying to throw my money at the clerics. The glowstone was for the roof of the glass box. I knew mobs wouldn't be able to spawn on the glass, but I thought it'd look good at night all lit up. The glowstone were positioned in exactly the same positions as the glowstone on the upper dirt layer of the farm down below. That meant spacing them out 10 blocks from one another. Easy enough once I had 2 edges put into place. Now this is impressive. Though flying over it did kind of look like I put a lot of crafting tables all over the place. Yet from the ground level, where the sheep were at, it looked like the ceiling of the Great Hall in Harry Potter. Since putting the sheep into their new homes and changing their colours, this is how much wool I had built up. Not much, but you multiply that by 4 per colour, and it's still not much. However, seeing as I have a lot of space to expand into, I can see us quite easily getting 150 sheep per colour once I have the iron for the collection system. As helpful as the auto smoters have been, they were no longer necessary. As a reward, I got a shit ton of experience. I'm talking Ender Dragon's level of XP. Here's the place at night too. It looks even better than in the daytime. I really like how it turned out. Okay, and that's going to be it for this episode. There is going to be a bonus episode for members only, so if you want to watch it, hit that join button. I'm also playing Hades 2 at the moment, so you can catch that there as well, though my live commentary needs a lot of work, so be patient. Anyway, that's it. Alright, bye.